Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 28th, where I wanted to put closure onto Jane Eyre, and I also wanted to talk about Dickinson. But first I wanted to read a statement to you. As you know, the Supreme Court recently overturned the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling. I don't believe it's my place to persuade you one way or another about this decision, although I have my personal opinion about it, as I suspect you do as well. However, what I do want to say as the instructor of a Women in Literature course is that I've seen increasing challenges to and bitterness towards women in our society. I encourage you to reflect upon what we have learned in class about the place of the female in the 1800s and actively support the strides women have made since then. I also ask that you read the article entitled 5 Things Women Couldn't Do in the 1960s, which I just posted on my personal social media page, accompanied with the following statement. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Thank you. And you'll see in our notes below that I've included the link to that article. And moving forward with Jane Eyre, I also wanted to talk a little bit about our course outline because our semester is coming soon to a close. So as you can see that today we're talking about Dickinson, and your journal on Jane Eyre, if you haven't already submitted it, would be due today via my email as usual, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, and that would be due at 11:59 p.m. And then on Thursday, we are going to discuss incidents in the life of a slave girl. And ideally, your journal would be due on that day, on the 30th at 11:59 p.m. That would be journal number 4. And then we finish the semester on the 5th of July, which is a Tuesday, where we discuss the awakening. And then ultimately, journal number 5 for the awakening would ideally be due at 11:59 p.m. at that point. Because our final exam is the 7th of July, I will post that at 9 a.m. and you'll have 24 hours in which to respond. If you were taking that final in person, we would do it in class, and you would have approximately 3 hours to respond. It will be a series of multiple essay questions that you get to choose from, and it's open book, open notes. So basically, you can just synthesize some of the elements that we've been talking about in class. And ideally, that would also be the date in which paper number 2 would be due. And paper number 2 is going to be very similar to what you've done with paper number 1, except that you would be focusing on the later sets of readings. So that would be either Jane Eyre or Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl or The Awakening. Dickinson is also a possibility, but talking about poetry is a little bit of a different experience than talking about a novel or even a short story. And that said, as you know, that I've indicated that if you need an extension, you should come ask for one, but our times for extensions are limited as well. The last date in which you can hand in any of your journals or any of your papers or any of your revisions of papers would be on Monday, the 11th of July. Note that there isn't an extension for the final examination. I wanted to make sure that everybody had an equal amount of time for seeing the final and taking the final. Again, you should devote approximately 2 to 3 hours to that final examination. So what this means is that you could finish the semester on the 8th, which is Friday. But if you needed that additional weekend to catch up on journals or to even catch up with your paper number 2, you could do so. But by the 11th, everything needs to be handed in because I need to submit in my final grades as well. The good news is that after Jane Eyre, the readings go much more quickly. Jane Eyre was the longest read of this semester, though as many of you indicated on your discussion or in your discussion forum responses that Jane Eyre tended to go rather quickly compared to the other texts that we've read over the course of the semester. And what I wanted to do was just to highlight a few of the Jane Eyre quotes, and there are so many, as many of you indicated in your discussion forum responses, that are significant. But the first that I wanted to talk about is that the idea of just Jane Eyre being a modern day heroine. And that Jane Eyre, and this is in the introduction, seems to be possessed of the greatest treasure a woman can have, self-respect. And also in the introduction, Jane may be the first heroine in fiction to know that she needs her own identity more than she needs marriage. Her determination not to relinquish selfhood for love could well belong to a contemporary heroine. But in terms of the Charlotte Bronte text itself, we talked a little bit about Jane's progression from childhood into adulthood. And we see how Jane goes from a child needing love to an adult wanting love. And one of the things that Jane talks about with her friend, Helen Burns, at the boarding school is about the need for love. And Jane says at one point, "You're good to those who are good to you," is all I ever desired to be. If people were always kind and obedient to those who are cruel and unjust, the wicked people would have it all their own way. They would never feel afraid, and so they would never alter, but would grow worse and worse. When we are struck at without a reason, we should strike back again very hard. I'm sure we should, so hard as to teach the person who struck us to never do it again. But of course, one of the things that we've seen in all of the text is the idea of balance, and we see how Jane is able to show forgiveness, for instance, to her aunt in a way that she never could have done in her childhood. And Jane continues on and talks about to Helen that if others don't love me, I'd rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated, Helen. Look here, to gain some real affection from you or Miss Temple or any other whom I truly love, I would willingly submit to have the bone of my arm broken, or to let a bull toss me, or to stand behind a kicking horse and let it dash its hoof at my chest. And of course, Helen, one of the things that Helen is able to teach Jane about is the idea of the love of God. And while certainly this text is critical of organized religion, it's a very spiritual text. Later on, and this is when Jane is an adult and she's at Thornfield, she talks a little bit about how stifling Thornfield is. It's vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. That happens to be in chapter 12. And of course, we know that Jane very actively decides to take a role in her own happiness ultimately. But that's not to say that she isn't going to experience lots of trials and tribulations, which we see throughout the text. One of the things we see, though, is Jane's appearance begins to change. That Jane, I had suggested, is named Jane in part because of the expression plain Jane. And in chapter 16, the idea is that when Jane is reunited with Bessie, that she looked better, that being Jane. I had more color and more flesh, more life, more vivacity, because I had brighter hopes and keener enjoyments. This is something that we talked about in Persuasion as well, when Anne Elliot begins to experience her bloom once again. What seems to be minor, but I think it is important in terms of our understanding of class during the time. This is in chapter 17, and this is where Jane is talking to Mrs. Fairfax. And Mrs. Fairfax tells Jane, this is the way that Jane can enter a room, considering, of course, that Jane is still a governess at this particular point, and Rochester has invited all of his friends, including Miss Ingram, and all of them have positions of superiority. So Miss Fairfax says, I'll tell you how to manage so as to avoid the embarrassment of making a formal entrance, which is the most disagreeable part of the business. You must go into the drawing room while it is empty, before the ladies leave the dinner table. Choose your seat in any quiet nook you like. You may not stay long after the gentlemen come in, unless you please. Just let Mr. Rochester see you are there, and then slip away. No one will notice you. Again, you remember that he insists that she be there, even though she obviously is uncomfortable. Part of that is his plan to make Jane want him more. And of course, we see how ultimately Jane finds out the secret that he's been harboring, and despite her feelings for Rochester, she cannot unite with him. And one of the things that she says, or at least thinks, after she learns the truth about Rochester's marriage to another, that she can't be with him because I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad, as I am now. Laws and principles are not for those times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they. If at my individual convenience I might break them, then what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I've always believed. And if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire, my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. And one of the things about Jane Eyre that probably makes this so popular is that we do get a happy ending, and that ultimately there can be a relationship between Jane and Rochester. But this is only when they are both equals. Jane finds out that she has money, which means that she's financially independent. And Rochester learns humility, and he also learns spirituality, so that by the ending of the text, they can both reunite. Now, of course, we talked a little bit about persuasion and as to whether or not that ending was satisfying or realistic. I suppose we could say the same thing about Jane Eyre, but considering how popular of a heroine that Jane Eyre happens to be in literature, I suspect that most readers are rather pleased that she gets her happy ending. So as we move forward, I wanted to talk a little bit about poetry, and specifically about a very well-known poet in our area, Emily Dickinson. You'll notice that while we are going to be discussing Emily Dickinson, I don't have a journal assigned for Emily Dickinson. That said, if you wanted to earn a little bit of extra credit in the class, you could certainly submit in a journal on Emily Dickinson. And one of the things I think about Emily Dickinson that's so interesting is the fact that she's written so much poetry, and so many have studied her, and even the scholars still struggle over some of the meanings of her poetry. In fact, stating to the effect that her poetry both reveals, because it oftentimes talks about human emotion, the human condition, but it also conceals, because so much of it is personal and so much of it is misunderstood or is incapable of being understood. Her writing also is very unorthodox, and I think that's quite fitting for a women in literature class, because we're talking about female authors who are unorthodox for their very time, just because of the role that women should play in the 1800s. In terms of her defying conventions, Emily Dickinson doesn't just defy conventions in her writing, in this instance grammatical conventions, things like capitalization or using dashes in place of commas. And this is something you need to be careful of when you're reading Emily Dickinson's poetry, that you are reading her original poetry and not the poetry that was edited and made more conventional. Her original poetry has dashes and flexible rhyme. It makes her poetry much more defiant, and I think much more interesting. And it oftentimes followed the patterns of Protestant hymnals, which is also interesting because she, like Jane Eyre, except Emily Dickinson is a real person, not a fictionalized one, very much had rejected the idea of organized religion in her adulthood, but still had this great sense of spirituality. And oftentimes would write about questions of the unknowable of human existence. Perhaps that's why some of her poetry might seem to be unknowable as well. Expect lots of paradox and contradiction, things like the woe of ecstasy, for instance, and her discussing the relationship between invisible and visible realms. So, in terms of her poetry, it oftentimes examines death, but death is portrayed as a positive more often than not in her poetry, and she speaks as if she's talking from the perspective of death. And some of her themes, which you might say might be themes that you find in great literature as a whole: love, loss, religion, nature, loneliness, defiance. She wrote over 1,700 poems, and she wrote them for herself. They were only published after her death, and again, editors standardized many of those poems so that they would follow grammatical conventions. And it really wasn't until the 1950s or so an editor by the name of Johnson published her poetry in its original form, and it made her poetry much more interesting, especially when we think about her biography, and that we know from the readings that we've done the expectations for female, especially of a particular class. And Emily Dickinson, living in Amherst, was the daughter of a lawyer, a very prominent one, so she would have been expected to eventually marry and have children and hold dinner parties, very much like Mary Elliott. And Dickinson did the exact opposite. She basically secluded herself in her room in her adulthood, wrote over 1,700 poems, never married, never had children. So rather than reading about a fictionalized character who breaks conventions, what we are doing is learning about a real life woman who broke conventions. And you can see that in the notes below, I've included a link to a biography about Emily Dickinson. And while it's a bit dated, I think it gives you a good overview not only of Emily Dickinson's life, but a good exposure to much of her poetry, since lines and even poems themselves are oftentimes quoted. It's approximately an hour long or so. And this is from PBS. So what I thought that we could do for our Dickinson unit is basically view this. One of the interesting things, too, about Emily Dickinson is that she attended Mount Holyoke College, as you will find out. And, of course, Mount Holyoke is one of our neighbor institutions. And I thought that for today's attendance question, that I would ask you to identify one Emily Dickinson poem, or even just one line within a poem that you find to be particularly powerful, and explain why. I can say that as an undergraduate, I was oftentimes frustrated by Emily Dickinson because I would oftentimes be challenged to understand her poetry as a whole. But that said, there would oftentimes be a phrase or a line or two that would be incredibly astute and seemed crystal clear. And I suspect that you might find the same as well. And again, you'll be exposed to a good amount of her poetry in the biography, so you're free to use any of those examples. But I had also included some links to Emily Dickinson's poetry in our course outline, as well as a book on Emily Dickinson's poetry, if you so wanted to choose one of her texts. Again, remember, you want to make sure that you're using a text that gives her poetry in its original form, with its use of dashes rather than use of periods, so or commas. And usually you can see that in just by a brief overview by looking to see whether her poetry ends in dashes rather than in commas. The fact that she even used a Protestant hymnal is important because, as you'll learn in the biography, that was perhaps one of the reasons why she used the dash, which is a much longer pause. And that allowed for taking a breath, let's say, if one were singing a hymnal, to go to the next line. But it also is yet another way that Emily Dickinson showed her ability to basically question the norms of the time, because again, she's using a religious hymnal but in a non-religious way. That said, I thought that before you watch that documentary, and it's approximately an hour or so long, so that'll be the bulk of this class, I thought that I would read to you one of my favorite Emily Dickinson poems and talk to you a little bit about it. And this is also a poem that you are free to reference in your discussion forum section about poetry, Emily Dickinson's poetry, if you wanted to. And it's entitled Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is the first line of her poem, because none of her poems were titled. Because again, she didn't write them for publication, she wrote them for herself. And it reads, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And one of the interesting things about this particular poem is the narration of the poem. The very last stanza, and stanzas are basically divisions in poetry that work much like paragraphs in prose. They should basically deal with a particular topic, and then there would be a break, and then you go to the next stanza or the next topic. The last stanza says, since then 'tis centuries. In other words, all of this happened in the past, where she's talking about how death stopped for her. She can't stop for death because death makes the determination of when we go to the afterlife. We don't make that determination. Death is capitalized, personifying death as an entity. And she talks about death in rather positive terms, that death is kind. And they drive slowly in a carriage. There is a long tradition of life as a journey, for a metaphor. And they basically pass all of the stations of life, or all of the stages of life in the earthly realm before they move to the spiritual realm when she transitions from human form to her spiritual form. They drove slowly and knew no haste because there is no such thing as time in eternity. And labor and leisure too are no longer necessary in eternity. And death is referenced as not only kind but civil, because the human world comes with stress and pressure and pain. And all of those do not exist in the afterworld. And we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So this is representational of childhood. We passed the fields of gazing grain, and this represents adulthood and working the fields for grain. And we passed the setting sun, which represents the ending of life, old age. Or rather, the sun passed us, and the dews drew quivering and chill. And notice how there's a transition here in terms of the time. We're going from day to evening. And we are also moving from the earthly realm to the spiritual realm. For only gossamer, my gown, and my tippet, which is another word for shawl, only tulle. These are very thin, transparent kinds of fabrics. That too is something of the earthly realm, needing clothing for protection against the elements or because of social conventions. Again, all of those are unnecessary in the afterlife. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground, cornice being an architectural element of a roof, that this entity is so far away it's barely visible. It just seems like a swelling of the ground. And ultimately, this could represent a church, or it could represent a tomb. And then our very last stanza. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. And again, she's reflecting upon the past when she transitioned from the earthly to the spiritual. I first surmised the horses' heads. And of course, this is in reference to her being in a horse-drawn carriage, but it's also a biblical reference to the horsemen of the apocalypse. First surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity, or eternity. You notice the rhyme is not necessarily always exact in Dickinson, but again, she took great, I think, pride in breaking many of the conventions of the time. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I hope you enjoy the biography linked below to Emily Dickinson, which talks a little bit about her life and a little bit about her writings. And the next class, we will talk about Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which will be a much faster read because it also is a biography, autobiography in this instance. So it's less literary. And that said, there are literary elements to it, but it gives us an idea of the contrast in the same world of privilege that the Elliot family lives in, or the Victor Frankenstein, or the Rochester, exists a time of slavery. So I wanted to talk about that contrast. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class. Take care. Bye bye.